reading just to kick things off for Jared. So we've got Revelation 21, 1 to 5. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things had passed away." He who was seated on the throne said, "I am making everything new."
Well, good morning, Burwood Church. Can you believe it? We're at the end of the story. 21 sermons ago, we started in the book of Genesis, and step by step, we've been working our way all the way through the story of God and the story of us and the story of this world. And it's really exciting to be able to land the plane here on what is probably one of my favorite topics, and that is recreation. And so today we're going to be unpacking and exploring what is this eternal home that we are looking forward to at the end of the story. Now, I don't know about you, but I love being immersed in nature and immersed in God's creation. And when Kylie and I plan a holiday, one of the first things I usually do is I usually get on the computer and go to Google Maps somewhere, and I just start sort of scouring the internet for somewhere beautiful, because I just love immersing myself in the outdoors. And I think one of the reasons is there's something about being immersed in God's creation that really speaks to me, and maybe you've had that experience as well. Now, a few years ago, I went on a trip to Ethiopia, and it was a church trip, and it was kind of lots of busy things we're doing, but at the end of it, the whole team that we were with went home, but my friend and I, we wanted to go and explore a bit of God's creation in the outdoors, and we had a few days. We jumped down to Kenya, and we went to a place called the Masai Mara National Park. And now, the Masai Mara National Park, if you've never heard of it before, it's kind of like the Lion King, but in real life. Every animal that you see on that show is there, and there's just such a density of animals. And even before you arrive at the park, there's all sorts of animals. We saw zebras and wildebeests. And I've got a picture here of, let's see if we can get this to work this week. Grace, can you give us the next? Here we go. So here's a picture. This is just before we got to the park, and you might see there's some school children walking down the road to school, and there's these big giant giraffes just walking by, just as if it's another day near the Masai Mara. And so that's on the way into the Masai Mara, but once you get in, go to the next slide, there's all sorts of incredible things. There's thousands of zebra. Next slide. Huge herds of elephants that would just march right past your vehicle, and some of these got so close it felt like they were about to walk into your vehicle that you were in. Next slide. Huge cats. This line actually went so close to the front of our vehicle that it actually pushed up against the front of it, and you could almost reach out and touch it. Next one. Leopards. Here's one of the ones that we spotted in the tree that came again right past our vehicle. And it's not just the adult animals that you see there. Next slide. Here's a little baby lion cub that we saw hiding in the long grass. And then another slide. Here's one of the little baby elephants. And so it's just amazing to be going through here and just seeing all of God's creation. And I remember being there watching all these animals and just being amazed at this incredible, the future home that God has in store for us is something like this, with all of these incredible creations right there to enjoy and to be a part of. But the thing is that even though in the Masai Mara it's like God's handiwork on display, and it all testifies there to the goodness of God and the love of God, it's not all good there in the Masai Mara. And even though there's all this beauty, there's this really dark side that is very hard to miss when you're there. For example, this next picture here, this is a topi, and the reason it's standing up on this little hill there is it knows that anywhere in the long grass around. It could be a lion or some sort of predator that's stalking there. And so it's very aware of this dark danger that exists there. Next slide. Here's this big majestic lion with this incredible mane, but you just got to look at his face there and you can see there's a harsh reality that exists here as well. And some sort of battle scar that's on his face. And the final slide of these pictures. At the end of our trip, we came across this fight scene, and there was this group of hyenas and the lionesses over this zebra that had recently been killed, and it was just like being in a nature documentary. But it was beautiful, but also quite violent and horrific at the same time. Again, God's beauty on full display, but there's in our world around us, there's this dark reality that is very hard to miss. And this is not just true in the Masai Mara, but our world over, everywhere we look. God's creation is beautiful and it's glorious, but it's also very broken. And our world is longing for something more. Our world is longing for that darkness and that brokenness to be done away with. I want to read for you a verse in Romans, and Romans chapter 8 and verse 19 through to 21. And it says this: "For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God." When Adam and Eve took that fruit from that forbidden tree, they didn't just drag themselves into sin and destruction and evil and all of its consequences, but they dragged the rest of the creation in our world into all of that as well. And so it's not just the human race that it finds itself trapped and burdened by sin, but creation itself is burdened by this and is longing for a better day. And what this verse here is saying is that God and his grand plan of salvation doesn't just have people in his sights, but God is looking to one day restore the whole of his creation, and including our world as well. Now I want to show you this in 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 10. Now this is a passage that sort of highlights some of the things that we've been looking at over the last couple of weeks. And in 2 Peter chapter 3 verse 10, Grace, can we get the slide there? The first verse that we're going to read here in verse 10 is kind of a bit of a scary verse. And it says this: "But the day of the Lord," and that's language that sounds very similar to the second coming sort of language, and we've been talking about it over the last few weeks, but the day of the Lord will come like a thief. And then it says, "The heavens will disappear with a roar, the elements will be destroyed by fire, and the earth and everything done in it will be laid bare." Now, how do you feel about that verse? Bit of a scary sort of verse there. Now, from the perspective of the saved, the second coming is awesome news. But for we who have put our trust in Jesus will be resurrected from the dead if we've died. We'll receive new bodies, these glorified bodies, and we'll be off to live with Jesus in heaven. But for the rest of our planet, the second coming means destruction. Now that destruction would be terrible news if it wasn't for what we see down in verse 13. And verse 13 says this: "But in keeping with his promise, we are looking forward to a new heaven and a new earth where righteousness dwells." Yes, the world is going to be destroyed, but only so that it can be remade and rebuilt and recreated once again. Now, something that I've never really thought about until this week is that what we see here is kind of like a death and resurrection, but not of people, but of our actual planet itself. And what we see here is in the progression of the story of salvation, we see Jesus has his resurrection, and then he sort of brings everything with him as well. And so the story goes, you see Jesus, he dies upon the cross, and there's this death and there's this burial, but at the end of those 3 days, Jesus raises from the life, and he has this glorified body. And so it starts with Jesus. And then we get to the second coming, and we see that all of God's children and followers who have died, they've experienced a death, but then they experience a resurrection as well. And they receive these new bodies that are incorruptible and immortal, and they're brought into that new reality that Jesus has started. But then we get to our world, and the world has that same sort of experience as well. The world experiences a kind of death. And at the end of that, God remakes it, and the world experiences a kind of resurrection as well. Jesus brings everything into his new reality that he started on that resurrection morning. Now, as we think about the idea of recreation, I want us to reflect back a little bit on the original creation that we see right back in Genesis chapter 1. And I want you to take note of how the story of the Bible began. So in Genesis chapter 1, in verse 1 to 3, it says this: "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light." So just take note of how the earth begins. I get this picture. I don't know how you, sort of what comes in your mind when you read this, but for me, when I sort of try to imagine this, I picture this earth that is formless and empty, this kind of dark, watery mass. There's nothing too spectacular about it. It's kind of the raw materials there, ready to be made into something. And maybe you can imagine, like, one of the hobbies that my wife has, she loves making things out of clay. And kind of just imagine a ball of clay that's just sitting there ready to be created into something wonderful. And then with that, God starts speaking into that creation, and life and nature starts bursting forth. Let there be light, and light springs into existence. Let there be sky and lands, and these things suddenly appear. Let there be birds and fish and animals and finally humans. And as God speaks and God creates, there's this incredible scene that unfolds, and the world that we have springs into this beautiful place. Imagine what it would have been like if you could have been there during those 7 days, that creation week, and you could have seen God at work. What would that have felt like? What would that have looked like? What would that have sounded like to be a part of that? Now, I suppose, I expect, since the angels were created back then, I wonder if they were looking on. I wonder if they were looking on as God created, and they were watching this and just being amazed at this incredible scene that was taking place. It must have been spectacular. Now, the last few messages that we've been looking at, we've been exploring what the Bible teaches after the events of the second coming. And this is something that is a really mysterious sort of topic because we haven't been there yet, and we haven't yet experienced these things. But there are little insights that we see in Scripture about what's going to happen after Jesus comes back. And I want to summarize for you a couple of the things that we've talked about in the last 2 weeks. So you might remember 2 weeks ago, Sylvia talked about the topic of the millennium that we read about in Revelation chapter 20. And in Revelation 20, we see this period of 1,000 years begins with the resurrection. And Jesus comes back, and God's people are raised from the dead, and they go and they live with Jesus for 1,000 years. And then at that sort of simultaneous time, we see that the physical earth and everyone and everything on this earth is destroyed, and it goes back to this state of formlessness and nothingness. And only Satan and his angels are left there to roam around this earth for that 1,000 years. And then Fraser last week talked about what's going to happen at the end of the millennium. And as I said, these are sort of difficult passages to try to wrestle with and try to unpack. But the sequence that we seem to find there at the end of the millennium is we see this image of God's city descending down to this earth. And those who were not in that first resurrection are raised from the dead, and they're raised to life. And we get this picture where everyone is once again back together upon the earth. And Satan, it talks about Satan convincing the masses of people to go into to attack the city. And at the end of that, we see that there's this final act of judgment and maybe even it's an act of protection as well for those within the city, that this fire comes down and destroys everything that's outside of the city. And we read in Revelation chapter 20, verse 14 to 15, the last couple of verses of this scene, which Fraser shared with us last week. It says, "They marched across the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of God's people, the city he loves, but fire came down from heaven and devoured them." And then next couple of verses, I missed it. I'm going to open up my Bible, and you've got your Bibles there. Revelation chapter 20. It was supposed to be the last one we had there. Revelation chapter 20, the last two verses of that chapter. It says, "And death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. The lake of fire is the second death." And so we have this final destruction of sin, and we see the final things that are destroyed there, as Fraser unpacked, was even death itself. And Hades, which is this term that elsewhere in Scripture is translated as hell, all of that destructiveness is finally put to the flames and finally is destroyed. And then verse 15, "If anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire." So you get this scene where God's people are inside the city, but outside the city, there's as those fires of destruction go out, you end with nothingness. You end up with everything being destroyed. And once again, you have a kind of situation like we saw right back in Genesis chapter 1. Imagine we had the illustration of making something of clay, and you imagine you have this ball of clay, and the artist works something beautiful. But that artist can always get that clay and to throw it on the table and to roll it back into a formless ball, ready to create something once again. And that's kind of the picture that I see in here. Outside of the city, we see a formless mass of raw materials waiting for what's going to happen next. Which brings us to Revelation chapter 21 and verse 1. And one of the things that I think we sometimes miss with this verse is because it starts a new chapter, often we just associate this verse with the chapter that comes. But really, this verse is also the conclusion of the previous chapter. And so you see this scene of this desolate earth, but then you get to chapter 21, verse 1, and everything is made new once again. And it says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away." So Revelation 20 finishes with this kind of dead earth, but Revelation 21 begins with the earth being resurrected. And we're not told really a whole lot about this resurrected event. But the way I picture it, I kind of imagine it being like Genesis 1 all over again, where God is speaking and life is jumping and springing forth into existence once again. And a thought that really excites me about all of this is where we might be during this recreation event. And if you think about Genesis chapter 1, I mentioned that the human race wasn't able to witness God's first act of creation in Genesis chapter 1. And if you think about the sequence there, the humans were created on day chapter 6. And so by the time they come along, all this incredible things that have happened have already reached their completion. And even when you read about the creation of Eve, and Eve was created after Adam, it talks about Adam being put into this kind of deep sleep, and he misses the creation of Eve as well until she is fully created. But when we get to the recreation, something else takes place, which I think is a really exciting thing. So when we get to Revelation 21, the question is, where are we? Where are we when we get to that place? And I think the way I read Revelation 20 and 21, it seems to suggest that we are still in that city. We are still in that city. And could it be that as God recreates the world, we get to watch? And we get to see God at work and doing his incredible acts of creation. And we get to see God as the ultimate artist and the ultimate craftsman do his incredible work of creation. What an awesome thing that's going to be. So as I finish up, I want to ask the question, what will this recreated world, our forever home, be like? What is it that we have to look forward to and expect? Now here I think we really need to have a lot of humility when we try to unpack this, because as I said before, these events haven't taken place yet. And because we haven't experienced them, our conceptions, our greatest imaginations of what this place will look like, I'm sure falls a long way short. There's an interesting quote from the book, The Great Controversy, which says this: "Human language is inadequate to describe the reward of the righteous. it will be known only to those who behold it. No finite mind can comprehend the glory of the paradise of God. What this is saying is that the very language that we have doesn't have the words, doesn't have the ability even to describe how wonderful this new home is going to be. To give you a little illustration of the challenges of describing something that you haven't experienced yet, on a different trip that I went to, this was back when I was at college, I went on a trip to Vanuatu and we got to explore some of the really remote islands and villages in Vanuatu. And some of the places there really have a wholly disconnected from the outside world. And I remember being in this one village, and in this village they had no electricity, and a lot of the people there had never been out of that place. And so they're really sheltered from many of the things that we have seen so often from looking at TV or the internet or things like that. And I was talking to this man who had heard about Sydney, and he wanted to go to Sydney. And so he said, "Jared, tell me what Sydney is like." And so I looked around me and I saw like these little woven huts, and I was thinking, how on earth do I describe what this big concrete jungle looks like? I mean, that's what I would say, a concrete jungle. But I remember describing it, and I said, okay, so in Sydney you have these things called skyscrapers. And I said, they're kind of like huts, but they're 20 coconut trees tall. And I just remember trying to explain to him and thinking, this is really hard when you haven't actually been there and seen it. And I found it really funny to sort of imagine what he was probably seeing in his mind. And I sort of imagined him seeing this sort of rickety woven hut that sort of stretches way up into the sky. And then I tried to explain what trains were like and explain there's like this box, and you get this money, you put it in the box and it spits out this other little ticket thing, and then you put this in another box and it lets you through, and then there's this big, trying to explain what this big long train looked like, and just realizing that all I could do was try to use some sort of metaphor from the things that he had experienced, but it was very hard to explain something that he had not yet actually experienced himself. And so when we come to trying to imagine the new earth, and when you read sort of the descriptions in Revelation in 21 and elsewhere, sometimes the picture in your mind seems a bit like fantastic, like incredible, but kind of strange and quirky. And could it be that we're trying to grasp these eternal realities with the experiences that we've only had up to this point? And so, with that big disclaimer, let's have a look at a couple of passages about what this new earth might look like. And so, Revelation 21 and verse 3 and 4 says this: "And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them, and they will be his people. And God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away.'" So what will the new world be like? Well, firstly, there will no longer be a separation between God and us. Now, I know God is here in our worship service today, and he's here and he lives within us, but still there's this sense of separation that we still have, in that we can't just go up to God and talk with him and see him and walk with him and in the same way that this is describing here. And so what we see is that heaven, the dwelling place of God, seems to not now be out there somewhere, but has some way been joined together with us in our world, in our home, in our experience here on earth. Now, heaven on earth, I don't know how to wrap my mind around that idea, but I don't know what it's going to be like, but what I do know is that it's going to be incredible. So that's the first thing we see here. The separation between God and with us will be removed. Second thing we see here is not so much what is going to be there, but all the things that are not going to be there. And we see here that in the new world, there's going to be no tears, no death, no mourning, no crying, no pain. All of these messy, yucky things that we're so familiar with today, those things will be done away with. And what will that be like? Well, again, I've never experienced the world without all those things, so I don't know what it's going to be like. But I know that it's going to be amazing as well. Now, another passage, when we get to chapter 22, chapter 22, verse 1 and 2, it says this: Again, describing this final resting place for us, this eternal home that we have. It says, "Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb down the middle of the great street of the city. On each side of the river stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month, and the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations." Now, does this remind you of anywhere else in the Bible? This idea of this river flowing through, this tree of life. It sounds very much like the Garden of Eden, doesn't it? Yes, it's describing it as kind of like this city, but in the center of it is God, and there's this river and all this Garden of Eden language that's taking place. And what this teaches me is that our future home in some way is going to resemble that original home that God created for Adam and Eve. And what it seems to be saying is that God's original plan, that original vision that he had in Genesis chapter 1 is finally realized, and we get to be a part of it. There's this incredible symmetry that we see in the story of the Bible. If you look at the first couple of chapters of this story that we've been unpacking for the last 21 weeks, the first 2 chapters you see this perfect God in a perfect world and perfect humans, and there's this perfect relationships and everything's wonderful and beautiful. When you go to the last 2 chapters, you find the same thing. You see these perfect people in a perfect world and a perfect relationship with a perfect God. Now, when you go to the 3rd chapter from the beginning, you see the entrance of sin into this world, and it causes all of the mess that we've experienced so much. You go backwards from the end and you go to the 3rd last chapter, and you find the final destruction of sin. And then everything else between those first 3 chapters and the last 3 chapters is this outplaying of sin and God who's pursuing us and is pursuing his vision, working and doing everything necessary to bring our world back to the place he once designed for it to be. And in the very center of that story is obviously the beautiful story of Jesus and the cross and his act of salvation for us. And so the story ends just in a similar way to it starts. And the last couple of verses that I want to share with you are verse 3 and 4 of this chapter. And it says, "No longer will there be any curse." And that reminds me of again, Genesis 3, and there's this curse on the land, and all the issues that have happened, all of that will be stripped away. The curse will be gone. The throne of God and of the Lamb will be in the city, and his servants will serve him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. What will that be like to live with God in that perfect world? To have every remnant of that curse removed. To be able to see God's face. To be able to live with him and to serve him forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever. I don't know what that's going to be like, but I know that it's going to be wonderful. And so the story ends with God living with his people, living happily ever after. As all good stories seem to end, living happily ever after. And so as we finish this story, I hope that this has been an encouragement to you. It's certainly an encouragement to me. Sometimes in our world, it's easy to get discouraged by all of the mess that happens around us. But this is a reminder that one day all of that the mess will be taken away, and we will live with God in the world made new, and we will live in perfect happiness and a perfect relationship with God forever and ever and ever.